Throughout European history, the official queen attended balls, raised heirs, and posed for portraits. But real political power often sat in the bed of the king's favorite mistress. Welcome to the hidden courts, where mistresses signed treaties, started wars, and made or broke ministers, all from behind the bedchamber door. Did Madame de Pompadour truly spark the 7 Years' War out of personal revenge? How did Alice Keppel become the secret back-channel between the British king and the Foreign Office? And why did an Irish dancer's influence drive the King of Bavaria from his throne? Night after night, these women pulled strings that could topple empires, while the official queen smiled for the painters. Let's slip behind the velvet curtain and meet the unofficial rulers who shaped Europe, one whispered counsel at a time. For centuries, the history books told a simple story. Kings ruled, queens consorted, ministers advised, and wars were decided by men in powdered wigs around polished tables. But the letters recently pulled from dusty archives across Europe tell a very different tale. One that historians are only now fully piecing together, because the women at the center of it were systematically erased from the official record. Their portraits were painted over, their correspondence was burned, their very names were scratched out of court registries, as if removing a mistress from the canvas could remove her influence from history. Yet the influence was undeniable. When Madame de Pompadour whispered in Louis XV's ear, France entered a war that would cost 1 million lives and lose an empire. When Diane de Poitiers opened her lover's royal mail each morning, she answered it herself, signing decrees with a hyphenated name that fused hers with the king's. When Alice Keppel entertained the British Prime Minister for tea, she was relaying messages that the Foreign Office could not deliver directly to the monarch. And when Lola Montez danced her way into the Bavarian court, she triggered riots so severe that the king was forced to abdicate his throne. These were not merely favorites. They were kingmakers, gatekeepers, and unofficial prime ministers operating from the most intimate room in the palace, which raises the question at the dark heart of this story. How did women with no legal standing, no official office, and no right to be heard end up shaping the fate of nations? And what happened to them when the crowns they guided ultimately fell? Because the answer begins not in a bedchamber, but with a woman who turned personal fury into continental war. That woman was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, though the world would come to know her by a title that still echoes through the halls of Versailles, Madame de Pompadour. She was born in 1721 to a family that had more ambition than money, the daughter of a financier who was exiled for fraud and a mother who was known less for her virtue than for her connections. When Jeanne Antoinette was 9 years old, a fortune teller looked at the small, dark-haired girl and pronounced a prophecy so unlikely that her family clung to it like scripture. One day, she would reign over the heart of a king. No one could have guessed that this bourgeois child would not only capture the heart of Louis XV, but would go on to control the foreign policy of the most powerful kingdom in Europe, all from a suite of rooms just above the king's own bedchamber. But before we step into that gilded world, we have to understand the strange and intricate machinery of the royal court itself, because the position that Pompadour would eventually occupy was not created for her. It was a role that had existed for centuries, as old as monarchy, yet its power was entirely unwritten. The official queen had a title, a coronation, a seat on the throne beside her husband. She produced heirs and presided over ceremonies, but her political power was often severely constrained, hedged in by protocol and the expectation that she remain a symbol, not a strategist. The real access to the king's ear, his unguarded thoughts after the formal councils had ended for the day, belonged to a different woman entirely. They called her the maîtresse en titre, the official mistress, and her influence was recognized by everyone at court, even if it was never printed in the State Almanac. At its peak, the role functioned as a kind of shadow prime minister. The maîtresse en titre controlled appointments to the highest offices, dictated which nobles received audiences, and steered the direction of treaties and wars. She was the last voice the king heard before sleep, and the first voice he sought upon waking, and foreign ambassadors quickly learned that if you wanted to persuade France, you did not send your petition to the queen. You sent it, with the appropriate gifts and flattery, to the woman behind the bedchamber door. Yet the position was fragile beyond measure. A mistress held power not by law, but by the king's continued affection, and that affection could vanish overnight. She was surrounded by enemies: the legitimate queen, the princes of the blood, the church, and rival courtiers who circled like wolves. She could make one misstep and lose everything: titles, wealth, even her freedom. History is littered with the names of women who rose to dazzling heights only to be dismissed with a letter and banished to a distant estate. The stakes were as high as any throne. Against this brutal landscape, Jeanne Antoinette Poisson launched one of the most improbable campaigns in court history. As a young woman, she married Charles Guillaume Lenormand de Thiel, a man she did not love but whose money and connections placed her at the edge of the king's orbit. She began hosting a salon where philosophers, writers, and artists gathered, and she deliberately cultivated the image of a woman of intellect, taste, and wit. She knew that the king, bored with his aging queen and stifled by the formality of Versailles, was drawn not to mere beauty, but to charm and conversation. She made herself impossible to ignore. In 1745, at a masked ball at Versailles, Jeanne Antoinette finally captured the king's eye. Dressed as a shepherdess among a sea of silk and satin, she was pursued by the king, who is said to have dropped his mask and kissed her hand. Within weeks, she was installed at the palace as the king's mistress, given a new title, Marquise de Pompadour, and apartments directly above the king's own. The prophecy whispered in her childhood had come to pass, but the real test was only beginning. The early days were precarious. The court was horrified, a commoner in the royal bed. The aristocrats mocked her bourgeois origins, scribbling vicious pamphlets called poissonnade, a pun on her maiden name, Poisson, meaning fish, that suggested everything from low birth to moral filth. The queen, Marie Leschinska, though long resigned to her husband's infidelities, watched with quiet pain. The church demanded she be sent away, and Louis himself, though infatuated, was known for his fleeting attentions. But Pompadour had something that none of her enemies anticipated. She understood that the way to keep a king was not through the body, which inevitably tires, but through the mind. When their physical relationship cooled around 1751, rather than fade into obscurity, she orchestrated an extraordinary transformation. She became the king's dearest friend, his indispensable advisor, his partner in all but name. She arranged for a private residence called the Parc aux Cerfs, where the king could find younger mistresses, removing herself as a sexual rival while retaining complete emotional and political control. It was a masterstroke that would have made any statesman envious. Now firmly fixed in the king's trust, Pompadour turned her attention to the machinery of government. She attended the king's council meetings, often sitting silently in a corner where she could observe every minister. She built an intelligence network of spies and informants within the court. She read dispatches, annotated memoranda, and recommended men for offices who had one essential qualification: loyalty to her. The Duc de Choiseul, who would become one of the most powerful foreign ministers in French history, owed his position to Pompadour's patronage. She was, in effect, the gatekeeper of the realm, and this is where a personal insult would set the world on fire. Frederick II of Prussia, the brilliant and ruthless monarch who had turned his small kingdom into a military power, was not the sort of man to mince words. He considered himself an enlightened king and a witty one, and he viewed the French court with a cynic's eye. When he heard that the real power behind Louis XV was a former bourgeois mistress, he made a remark that was meant to be a clever aside but would cost more than he could possibly imagine. The exact phrasing varies with the telling, but the sentiment is universally agreed upon. Frederick said, in essence, that France was ruled by Louis XV, and Louis XV was ruled by a woman, and that the French war plans could be found not in the war ministry, but on the Marquise's dressing table. The jibe reached Versailles through diplomatic channels and was gleefully repeated by Pompadour's enemies, who thought it would humiliate her. Instead, it ignited a cold and absolute fury. Madame de Pompadour swore eternal vengeance on Frederick of Prussia. She was not content with a passing slight. She set out to destroy him and his kingdom. In the following months, she became the driving force behind a radical diplomatic reversal that historians still marvel at. For centuries, France's great enemy had been the Austrian Habsburgs. Now, Pompadour pushed Louis to abandon that ancient rivalry and ally with Austria, Russia, and Saxony against Prussia. It was a coalition designed to encircle Frederick and crush him. The negotiations were conducted with her knowledge and, in some accounts, her direct intervention, smoothing over objections from the king's ministers who were too frightened to oppose her openly. By 1756, the die was cast. France marched into war not over a territorial dispute or a legitimate grievance, but because the king's mistress had been insulted. The conflict that followed would become the 7 Years' War, a global catastrophe that stretched from the forests of North America to the plains of India. And that would ultimately cost France its colonial empire, its treasury, and its prestige. And in the center of it all, in her suite of rooms adorned with porcelain and pastels, a woman who had been told at age 9 that she would reign over a king's heart, now held the fate of millions in her lace-gloved hands. But even as the armies mobilized and the drums beat across Europe, the clock was already ticking on Pompadour's power, because a mistress who sets a war in motion cannot control how it ends, and the battlefield that would eventually claim her was not fought with muskets and cannons, but with ink-whispered conspiracies, and the one force that even a king could not command: public rage. The war that Pompadour had helped orchestrate began not with a thunderous defeat, but with a slow, grinding catastrophe. The alliance she had championed, France, Austria, Russia, Saxony, all arrayed against Frederick the Great's Prussia, looked invincible on paper. In reality, it was a patchwork of mistrust, conflicting goals, and incompetent generals, and the first years of the 7 Years' War revealed a truth that the gilded halls of Versailles could not hide. France was bleeding. Frederick, outnumbered and supposedly trapped, moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned Europe. He struck first in 1756, invading Saxony, and then in 1757, he crushed a combined French and Imperial army at Rossbach. Rossbach was not just a military defeat, it was a national humiliation. The Prussian army, outnumbered 2-1, routed the French in less than 90 minutes. The vaunted French cavalry broke and fled. The infantry dissolved into panic. Frederick's forces lost fewer than 600 men. The French and their allies lost thousands, along with their reputation. The news reached Versailles like a physical blow. The court, which had gossiped and plotted and mocked, fell suddenly silent. And then the whispers began again. But this time they had a target. The war that was supposed to crush Frederick was destroying France instead. And everyone knew whose war it was. The Poissonades, those vicious little pamphlets that had mocked Pompadour's low birth, now took on a deadlier tone. They called her Madame Deficit, the harlot who had bankrupted the kingdom, the bourgeois fishwife who had sold France for a personal vendetta. But here is the thing that most history books miss. Pompadour did not flinch. She did not retreat from the political stage, even as the stage itself began to burn. She doubled down, throwing her energy into the war effort, firing generals who failed, promoting new ones, and working 18-hour days over maps and dispatches. She tried to hold the alliance together, writing flattering letters to Empress Maria Theresa of Austria, smoothing over the rivalries and bruised egos of her ministers. In a monarchy where the king sank into depression and indecision, Pompadour became, in effect, the acting prime minister, the one person still fighting, while everyone else was looking for someone to blame. Her health, never robust, began to crack. Tuberculosis, the great waster of the 18th century, had taken root in her lungs. She coughed blood into lace handkerchiefs and powdered her face to hide the pallor. But the courtiers noticed. They always notice. The predators circling her could smell weakness, and they began to close in. The Dauphin, the king's son, despised her openly. The Jesuits, whose power she had curtailed, plotted her downfall. The queen, quietly, patiently, prayed for her removal. And then there were the new mistresses. Younger, fresher, unburdened by political baggage, whom Pompadour herself had helped install at the Parc aux Cerfs. She had created the system to preserve her own influence, but the system was now producing rivals she could not control. Imagine, for a moment, the psychological terrain she had to navigate. She no longer shared the king's bed. She could not charm him with physical beauty, which was fading under the assault of illness and exhaustion. Her only currency was usefulness, and usefulness is a cold and unforgiving coin. Every letter she drafted, every general she appointed, every diplomatic note she annotated had to be perfect, because one visible failure would give her enemies the opening they craved. The court of Versailles, that glittering palace of mirrors, was also a hall of knives, and Pompadour was walking its length every single day. And yet she endured. For year after year, as the war dragged on and the casualty lists grew longer, she kept the king's ear, kept the ministers loyal to her in their posts, kept the machinery of state grinding forward. The Duc de Choiseul, her protégé, rose to become Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs and eventually Secretary of State for War. Through him, Pompadour's hand remained on the levers of power, even as her own body surrendered inch by inch to the disease that was eating her. Alive, but the turning point, the moment when the war became something far worse than a military disaster, arrived from across the Atlantic. The 7 Years' War was not confined to Europe. It was the first genuinely global conflict, fought in the forests of North America, on the sugar islands of the Caribbean, in the trading posts of India and the slave forts of West Africa. And in every theater, France was losing. Quebec fell to the British in 1759. Montreal followed the next year. French India, the dream of an Eastern empire, collapsed with the loss of Pondicherry in 1761. The Sugar Islands, the source of so much French wealth, were captured or blockaded. France's treasury emptied. Its navy was shattered. Its army was broken. And the woman who had set the war in motion sat in her apartments at Versailles, surrounded by art and music and dying flowers, and faced a reckoning that could not be postponed. The pamphlets of 1762 no longer bothered with wit. They were open calls for her head. The streets of Paris, that great restless beast of a city, grumbled with an anger that would, in another generation, burst into full revolution. The magistrates of the parliaments, traditional rivals of royal power, began to use the mistress's influence as a cudgel against the monarchy itself. They argued that the king had been seduced and misled, that France was being governed not by a sovereign, but by a harem, and that the only remedy was to restore the ancient authority of the nobles and the church. The monarchy, already deeply unpopular, was being hollowed out from within, and Pompadour was the visible wound through which the infection poured. The king, Louis XV, watched all of this with the peculiar passivity of a man who had never learned to face consequences. He still relied on Pompadour, still confided in her, still needed her to manage the affairs he found so tedious, but he would not defend her publicly. When the Parlements attacked her, he said nothing. When the priest denounced her from the pulpit, he went to Mass and knelt and prayed as if nothing were wrong. He was a king who wanted the power without the cost, and he left the cost to her. Pompadour understood this with a clarity that must have been excruciating. She was the lightning rod, the sacrifice that allowed the monarchy to survive another few years of its own failures. She was, in the oldest and most brutal sense, the woman who takes the blame. In February of 1764, at the age of 42, her body finally surrendered. Tuberculosis had ravaged her lungs for years, and in her final weeks she was too weak to leave her bed. She made her confession, received the last rites, and, according to witnesses, faced death with a composure that astonished even her enemies. When the end came on April the 15th, the king was at her side, but the old tenderness was absent. He is said to have watched her body being carried out of the palace, turned from the window, and remarked only that the weather was very bad for a funeral. Whether he truly said those words or not, the story persists because it captures something essential. The king's mistress, even the most powerful mistress in French history, was in the end a possession to be discarded when she was no longer useful, and her death was a matter of convenience, not grief. Her body was smuggled out of Versailles at night, hurried away to a convent chapel in Paris, because even in death, the public hatred that she had absorbed on the monarchy's behalf was too dangerous to provoke. No state funeral, no monuments, no official mourning. The woman who had run France for nearly 2 decades was interred quietly, and the court, with the speed of a tide erasing footprints, began to pretend she had never existed. The paintings of her were taken down. Her furniture was auctioned. Her letters, thousands of them, were scattered or burned, and the men who had owed their careers to her began to write her out of their memoirs, but the erasure could not change the facts on the ground. The war she had pushed for was over, concluded by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, and the terms were catastrophic. France surrendered Canada to Britain, along with its territorial claims east of the Mississippi River. It lost most of its foothold in India, retaining only a few trading posts. It ceded Senegal in Africa and several Caribbean islands. The British had won an empire on which the sun never set, and France had lost everything except its pride, which was mortally wounded. The national debt was a crushing weight that the monarchy would never repay, and the resentment, the deep and abiding sense that the country had been sacrificed by a corrupt and decadent court, would fester for a quarter of a century until it exploded into revolution. Pompadour cannot be held solely responsible for the 7 Years' War. The forces of imperial rivalry and dynastic ambition were far larger than any single person. But the historical record is clear that her personal vendetta against Frederick, her tireless advocacy for the Austrian alliance, and her control over the king's appointments made her a decisive figure. She was not a passive ornament. She was an agent of history, and the history she helped create was one of ruin. Now, here is the pivot that changes everything we have just learned, because the story of Madame de Pompadour is not unique. It is not even unusual. It is a single chapter in a much older pattern, a template that stretches back through the centuries and across the borders of Europe, and the deeper you go into it, the more unsettling the picture becomes. The erasure of Pompadour's influence after her death, the way her power was denied, even as it was exercised, the scapegoating, the silence, these were not accidents of one court or one reign. They were the structural fate of the royal mistress, the price demanded by a system that needed her labor, but could never afford to acknowledge it. 200 years before Pompadour was buried in the dark of night, another woman had already lived this same trajectory, only more completely, more absolutely, and with a twist of cruelty that makes Pompadour's story look almost gentle by comparison. She was Diane de Poitiers, the mistress of King Henry II of France, and she did not merely whisper in the king's ear. She signed his letters for him, merging their names into a single seal. She raised his children. She held the real queen in a state of humiliating obscurity. And the power she accumulated over a quarter of a century was so total that the Queen, Catherine de' Medici, spent her entire marriage waiting for the moment she could take it all back. That moment arrived on a summer afternoon in 1559, when the king climbed onto a horse, carrying a lance that bore his mistress's colors instead of his wife's, and rode toward a fate that would not only kill him, but unleash upon Diane one of the coldest and most calculated revenges in royal history. Because the true question is not how a royal mistress gained power, it is what happens when the king dies, and the woman who was never meant to rule is left with nothing to protect her but the memory of his touch. Diane de Poitiers was 36 years old when she first caught the attention of the boy who would become her king. He was 17. She was a widow, famously beautiful, famously disciplined, with a cold intelligence that had already allowed her to navigate the treacherous currents of the French court under Francis I. Her husband, Louis de Brezé, had been 40 years her senior, and when he died, Diane did what was expected of her. She wore black for the rest of her life, cultivated the image of a dignified widow, and waited for an opportunity. The opportunity arrived in the form of the king's second son, Henry, who had spent years as a hostage in Spain to secure his father's treaties, and who returned to France silent, brooding, and deeply uncomfortable in the glittering court that had never really wanted him. Diane saw what others missed. She saw a young man who craved stability, who had been starved of affection, and who could be shaped. She became his confidante, his tutor in the arts of courtly love, and very quickly his everything. When Henry married Catherine de' Medici in 1533, a political match that joined France to the powerful Florentine banking family, the bride was 14 years old, plump, eager to please, and utterly outmatched. Diane was already entrenched. Over the next 26 years, while Catherine waited in humiliating obscurity, watched her husband parade his mistress before the entire kingdom, and struggled even to produce an heir in the early years, Diane consolidated a position that made her the real Queen of France in everything except title. Let's get specific about what that power actually looked like, because the details matter. Diane's monogram interlocking D's set around an H was carved into the stonework of the royal palaces, more prominent than Catherine's own. The king's letters, the official correspondence of state, went out under a signature that blended their two names, Henry Diane. She governed access to the king, a function so sensitive that foreign ambassadors learned to route their dispatches through her. She attended council meetings where ministers who had spent their lives in public service were forced to defer to a woman with no official office. She helped raise the royal children, the Dauphin and the princesses, who called her Madame and feared her displeasure more than their mothers, and she used her influence to steer religious policy, because Diane was a fanatical Catholic, and her hatred of the growing Protestant movement in France led her to push Henry toward repressive measures that would poison the kingdom for decades. The English ambassador of the time wrote, with typical diplomatic understatement, that the Duchess of Valentinois ruleth the roast. He was not exaggerating. When the king wanted to levy new taxes, he consulted Diane. When France went to war against the Habsburgs, Diane's counsel shaped the strategy. She accumulated estates, titles, and a fortune so vast that she was one of the richest women in Europe. The crown jewels of France, the historic collection that had adorned generations of queens, were given to her to wear at state functions, while Catherine was forced to watch her rival sparkle in her own patrimony. Château de Chenonceau, the exquisite white palace that spanned the River Cher, was seized from its owner and handed to Diane as a gift, a palace that Catherine had desperately wanted for herself and would never forget. The psychological cruelty of this arrangement is almost beyond modern comprehension. Catherine de' Medici was the legitimate queen. She had married a prince, become queen consort, and eventually borne 10 children. By any standard of dynastic politics, she had fulfilled her obligations brilliantly. But her husband had built a second household, a parallel court, in which another woman wore the jewels, signed the decrees, and raised the children. Catherine's bed was cold, her political influence was zero. Her dignity was a public joke. She learned to smile, to wait, to observe, and to nurse a bitterness that would, in time, reshape France. The reckoning came on June the 30th, 1559. Henry II, now 40 years old, was celebrating the Peace of Cateau-Cambrésis, which had ended decades of war with Spain. As part of the festivities, a grand jousting tournament was held in Paris, and the king, a lifelong lover of martial sport, insisted on participating. He rode into the lists carrying a lance wrapped in the black and white ribbons of Diane's colors, not Catherine's. It was a public declaration, the last of many, that even at the apex of his reign, his loyalty belonged to the mistress, not the wife. The tilt began as a spectacle and ended as a catastrophe. The king's opponent, Gabriel de Montgomery, was a captain of the Scots Guard, and his lance shattered against Henry's shield. A splinter, long and sharp as a dagger, drove through the king's visor and into his eye, penetrating deep into his brain. Henry was dragged from the field, still alive but clearly dying. For 11 days, the court gathered in an agony of anticipation while the surgeons probed the wound, and the queen, suddenly, the most important person in the kingdom, issued her first and most crucial command. Diane de Poitiers was banned from the king's chamber. Diane, who had never been denied access to anything in her life, was frozen out. She waited in her apartments, listening to the footsteps in the corridor, the murmur of messengers, the slow unraveling of a quarter-century of power. When Henry died on July the 10th, she did not attend the funeral. She was not mentioned in his will. She was not granted a final audience. The king who had shared his name with hers was dead, and the woman who had waited in the shadows for 26 years was now the most powerful person in France, Catherine de' Medici, Queen Mother and Regent. Moved with a speed and precision that must have been rehearsed in her mind 1,000 times, she took possession of the royal seal. She recalled the ministers who had been loyal to Diane and replaced them with her own men. She demanded the crown jewels back, item by item, and when Diane tried to negotiate, Catherine cut her off with a coldness that left no room for interpretation. Then she demanded Château de Chenonceau, the palace that Diane had made her personal seat, and in exchange offered the far less desirable Château de Chaumont. Diane, recognizing that she no longer had any leverage, accepted. She was allowed to leave court, retreating to her estate at Annat, where she lived out her remaining years in a gilded exile, never again setting foot in the halls she had once governed. The erasure began almost immediately. Catherine began to shape the official narrative, one in which Diane had been a seductress who had bewitched a weak king, and Catherine herself was the long-suffering mother of the nation, the wise regent who had rescued France from a disgraceful chapter. The monograms were painted over. The official histories, written under Catherine's supervision, minimized Diane's role. The parallel queen, who had once ruled the roast, became a footnote, a cautionary tale about the dangers of feminine ambition. But here is what makes this story truly haunting, and what connects it directly to every mistress we are examining tonight. Catherine de' Medici's revenge was not merely personal. It was structural. It was the inevitable consequence of a system in which a woman could wield enormous power without any institutional protection. Diane had no army, no political party, no legal office, Her power was entirely relational, dependent on the life and favor of one man. And when that man died, the architecture of her influence collapsed instantly. She was not defeated by a superior strategy or a political rival. She was simply unmade by the biological fact of a king's mortality. This pattern, the rise, the reign, the catastrophic fall, and the systematic erasure, would repeat itself again and again across the centuries. But what happens when the system evolves? When the monarchy becomes constitutional, when the press turns public opinion into a weapon, and when the mistress must navigate not just the politics of the bedchamber, but the politics of the newspaper. That question brings us to a woman who was born more than 300 years after. Diane de Poitiers took her revenge exile, a woman who operated in the full glare of modernity, and who proved that even in an age of parliaments and prime ministers, the back channel could still run the world. Alice Keppel was the mistress of King Edward VII, and she was nothing like the mistresses who had come before. She was not a dancer or a courtesan from the fringes of society. She was an aristocrat, married to an earl, a society hostess who entertained prime ministers and archbishops at her dinner table. Her beauty was not the theatrical beauty of a pompadour or the cold perfection of a Diane. It was a warm, intelligent, deeply charismatic presence that made everyone in a room feel seen and attended to. Her discretion was legendary. She never wrote down a secret she could not trust to memory. She never flaunted her position or embarrassed the crown. She was, in many ways, the perfect mistress for the modern age. And that perfection made her more powerful, not less. Edward VII, known to his family as Bertie, had waited longer than any heir apparent in British history to ascend the throne. His mother, Queen Victoria, blamed him for his father's death and deliberately excluded him from state affairs for decades. When he finally became king in 1901 at the age of 59, he was a man who had spent his life seeking pleasure and companionship wherever he could find it, and he had found it with Alice Keppel since 1898. Their relationship was not a secret, exactly, but it was managed with such exquisite tact that even the king's wife, Queen Alexandra, tolerated it, sometimes even inviting Alice to family gatherings. The arrangement was understood and, within the peculiar code of Edwardian society, accepted. What made Alice Keppel different from 100 royal mistresses before her was her role in the actual machinery of government. She was not simply a companion who happened to overhear state secrets. She became, deliberately, and with the tacit approval of the highest officials, a conduit between the king and his ministers. The king, like many monarchs of the period, was still deeply involved in foreign policy and military appointments, but his personality was mercurial. He could be charming one moment and explosively angry the next. He was impatient with detail, suspicious of advisors, and prone to making decisions based on personal animosities rather than strategic logic. His ministers needed a way to manage him, a calm, trusted voice that could present difficult truths in a way he would accept. They found that voice in Alice Keppel. The Viceroy of India, a man named Lord Curzon, once spoke openly about the arrangement. There were occasions, he said, when the king was in disagreement with the Foreign Office, and Curzon was able, through Mrs. Keppel, to advise the king with a view to the foreign policy of the government being accepted. Think about what that sentence actually reveals. The Viceroy of India, one of the most powerful imperial officials in the world, was routing his arguments through the king's mistress because she had better access and more influence than any diplomat or cabinet minister. She was the back channel, the unofficial advisor, the person who could frame a policy argument so that the king would hear it without his usual defenses snapping into place. This was not a one-time favor. It was a recognized function. Prime Minister Asquith and his wife Margot sent her letters thanking her for her wise counsel. She understood how to translate the formal language of state into the personal language that the king responded to. She managed his moods, calmed his rages, and kept him in good humor with gossip, card games, and the kind of intelligent conversation that he craved and that the rigid protocols of court life rarely provided. She was, in every sense that mattered, a political operative, one who operated entirely outside the Constitution. The rewards for this labor were substantial. The king gave her shares in a rubber company, investments that eventually earned her £50,000, the equivalent of roughly £7.5 million today. She received jewelry, property, and the kind of financial security that allowed her to live in grand style. But the cost, the invisible tax that every royal mistress pays, was the impossibility of acknowledgement. Her political work had to remain hidden, not because it was illicit, but because it was impossible for a constitutional monarchy to admit that the king was being advised by a woman who was not his wife, not a minister, and not accountable to any electorate. When Edward VII died in 1910, Keppel found herself in a familiar position. The new king, George V, had no interest in continuing his father's arrangement. The political channels that had flowed through her drawing room dried up overnight. The letters stopped. The invitations ceased. Queen Alexandra, who had tolerated her for years, was now free to act, and Keppel was quietly but decisively pushed out of the inner circle. She lived on in comfort, her finances secure, her reputation relatively intact, but her power evaporated with the king's last breath. She was erased not by a vengeful queen like Catherine de' Medici, but by the quieter, more bureaucratic machinery of a new reign that needed to pretend the old one had been more respectable than it actually was. Now, at this point, you might be thinking that the story of the royal mistress is essentially a French story, a product of that particular court culture with its elaborate gallantry and its tolerance for extramarital arrangements. But that assumption would be dangerously wrong, because the same pattern, the same arc of rise, power, and catastrophic collapse played out in the most unlikely of settings, the conservative Catholic kingdom of Bavaria in the 1840s. And the woman at the center of it was not an aristocrat with generations of social training behind her. She was an Irish dancer named Eliza Gilbert, who remade herself into a Spanish performer, who called herself Lola Montez, and who brought a king to his knees with nothing more than a false accent, a smoldering stare, and a political agenda that terrified the establishment so completely that it sparked a revolution. Lola Montez was, by any objective standard, a fabulist of breathtaking audacity. She was born in Ireland in 1821, the daughter of a British army officer. She grew up in India, was married off briefly to a British lieutenant, abandoned him, and then, realizing that a single woman with no fortune had few options in the Victorian world, invented an entirely new identity. She became a Spanish dancer, adopting a stage name, a fabricated biography, and a costume that traded heavily on the European fantasy of Iberian passion. She was not a great dancer. By most contemporary accounts, she was barely competent, but she had something far more valuable than technique, an absolute radiating personal magnetism that made audiences, especially male audiences, forget what they were supposed to be judging. She toured across Europe, causing scandals in London, Paris, and Warsaw, accumulating a trail of broken hearts, outraged theater managers and men who had dueled over her honor. By 1846, she had reached Munich, the capital of Bavaria, and it was there that her restless, reckless life intersected with the destiny of a kingdom. King Ludwig I of Bavaria was 60 years old by that time, a man of genuine artistic sensibility who had transformed Munich into a city of museums and classical architecture. He was also a romantic, deeply susceptible to beauty, and profoundly bored with the formal duties of monarchy. When Lola Montez demanded an audience with him, a demand no ordinary performer would have dared to make. He granted it. The conversation that followed, according to the legend, included the king asking whether her famously voluptuous figure was the work of nature or art, and Lola, without hesitation, taking a pair of scissors and cutting open the front of her dress to show him exactly how natural it was. Whether the dress-cutting story is true or not, the result is not in dispute. Within weeks, Ludwig was utterly captivated. Within months, he had installed her in a palace, granted her a noble title, Countess of Landsfeld, and given her an annuity that made her one of the wealthiest women in the kingdom. But Lola Montez was not content to be a pampered companion. She had political convictions, and she used her influence over the king to pursue them with a ferocity that shocked the court. She was a liberal, an anti-clerical firebrand who hated the Jesuits and the conservative Catholic establishment that dominated Bavarian politics. She pushed Ludwig to appoint liberal ministers, to curtail the power of the church, and to institute reforms that threatened the old order at its foundations. When the Minister of State, Karl von Abel, and his entire cabinet objected to her being granted Bavarian nationality and the title of Countess, she had them dismissed, every last one, and replaced them with men more amenable to her agenda. A Protestant prime minister was installed at her urging, an act that the Catholic majority viewed as an open declaration of war. The university students of Munich, young and passionate, split into factions. Some, the liberals, rallied to Lola's defense, seeing her as a champion of progress. Others, the conservative and Catholic factions, saw her as a foreign seductress who had bewitched their king and was destroying the moral order of the nation. The university became a battleground of pamphlets, protests, and street brawls. And Ludwig, utterly under Lola's spell, responded not by seeking compromise but by escalating. At Lola's insistence, he closed the university entirely, an act that radicalized the students even further and sent the controversy spiraling out of control. By early 1848, a revolutionary fever was sweeping across Europe. Paris had erupted in February. Vienna was in chaos. And in Bavaria, the spark that lit the fuse was Lola Montez herself. The conservatives had found a symbol for everything they hated about the monarchy, and that symbol was the Irish dancer who had become a countess. Mobs gathered in the streets of Munich, demanding her expulsion. They attacked her palace, smashing windows and setting fires. Ludwig, faced with a choice between his throne and his mistress, tried desperately to hold on to both. He ordered Lola to flee for her safety, and she did, escaping Munich in disguise. But it was too late. The damage was done. On March the 20th, 1848, King Ludwig I of Bavaria abdicated his throne in favor of his son, Maximilian II. He was the only German monarch to be toppled by the revolutions of that year, and his downfall was directly attributable to his relationship with Lola Montez. The conservative Catholics who had led the uprising had achieved their goal. The king was gone, the liberal reforms were rolled back, and the foreign mistress who had dared to interfere in the politics of the nation was exiled forever. Lola Montez fled to Switzerland, then to England, and eventually to the United States, where she tried to rebuild her career as a dancer and lecturer. She told her story on stage, dramatizing her own life as a cautionary tale or a romantic adventure, depending on the audience. She married, divorced, and drifted through a series of failed ventures and fading hopes. By 1861, she was 39 years old, impoverished, and dying of the tertiary effects of syphilis. The woman who had brought down a king died alone in a boarding house in New York City, and her grave was marked with a stone that gave her name and her title, Countess of Landsfeld, a final reminder of the power she had once held and lost. Now, here is the pivot that reframes everything. Lola Montez was not a tragic anomaly. She was not an outlier. She was the most extreme example of a rule that applies across every case we have examined tonight. The royal mistress, whether she was an aristocrat like Alice Keppel, a bourgeois intellectual like Madame de Pompadour, a noble widow like Diane de Poitiers, or a self-invented performer like Lola Montez, always occupied the same structural position. She was granted enormous informal power, and she was denied any formal protection. She could make wars, appoint ministers, and influence policy, but she could not own the authority she exercised, and because that authority was lent to her by the king, it could be revoked at any moment, by death, by a change in affection, or by a political crisis that used her as a scapegoat. The erasure that followed was not a personal failure. It was the necessary conclusion of a system that needed the mistress's labor but could never admit to it. The official histories were written by the institutions that the mistress had threatened: the church, the nobility, the legitimate royal family. They had every incentive to minimize her role, to paint her as a seductress or a schemer rather than a political actor, and to bury her influence under layers of moralizing narrative. The letters that could have proven her political significance were burned. The portraits that showed her in positions of respect were taken down or reattributed. The historical record was scrubbed, and for centuries the story that remained was the simple, sexist fable of the fallen woman, the whore who dabbled in politics and got what she deserved. But something has changed in the last 2 decades, something that is quietly, inexorably rewriting the history we thought we knew. Archivists across Europe, working through the vast collections of state papers that were never properly catalogued, have begun to digitize the letters of the women themselves. The correspondence of Madame de Pompadour, thousands of letters that had been scattered across libraries from Paris to Moscow, is being reassembled. The household accounts of Diane de Poitiers, which record the gifts and payments that trace her political network, are being studied for the first time. The letters that Alice Keppel exchanged with prime ministers, long kept in private collections by families that were embarrassed to admit them, are trickling into the public domain. And what these documents reveal, line by line, is a reality that the official histories tried to bury. The royal mistress was not an ornament, she was an institution. This slow, silent, and absolutely revolutionary process of recovery is changing everything we understand about how power actually flowed through the courts of Europe. The kings were not the sole architects of policy. The queens were not the only female influence. The ministers were not the only counselors. A parallel government operated in the spaces between the official council chambers and the private apartments, and the women who ran it shaped the fate of continents. The question that remains, the question that takes us into the final and most devastating phase of our story, is not whether these women were powerful. It is how the system that gave them power also systematically destroyed them, and why that destruction was not a bug in the machinery of monarchy, but its most essential feature. The destruction of the royal mistress was not a tragedy that happened to her. It was a transaction she entered into, knowingly or not, the moment she accepted the king's favor. The power she wielded was real. It was documented in state papers, witnessed by ambassadors, and felt by the millions of people whose lives were altered by the wars she started and the treaties she shaped. But that power was always borrowed, and the collateral was her own historical existence. The monarchy would take her labor, her intelligence, her political genius, and her body, and in return, it would grant her a temporary throne in a shadow kingdom that would vanish the moment the sun hit it. What makes this transaction visible now, after centuries of successful concealment, is the slow and painstaking work of archivists who have been digitizing the private papers of European courts. This is not the history of official decrees and public ceremonies. This is the history of the back staircase, the private audience, the unsigned letter delivered by a trusted servant, and it is in these interstices that the mistresses emerge as the central political actors they were. Take the correspondence of Madame de Pompadour. When she died in 1764, her papers were scattered. Some were seized by the crown, some were inherited by her brother, the Marquis de Marigny, and some simply vanished into the vast, chaotic archives of the Ancien Régime. For 2 centuries, historians treated her letters as curiosities, the gossipy remnants of a royal favorite. But as those letters have been digitized and cross-referenced with the official correspondence of ministers and foreign ambassadors, a completely different picture has come into focus. Her letters are not personal chatter. They are strategic documents, full of policy recommendations, reports on military logistics, diplomatic assessments of foreign powers, and detailed instructions to the men she had placed in office. She was, in effect, running a parallel foreign ministry from her boudoir. One sequence of letters discovered in the Austrian state archives in Vienna reveals that Pompadour was conducting direct correspondence with Empress Maria Theresa during the 7 Years' War, discussing strategy, troop movements, and the coordination of the Allied armies. The French foreign minister, her protégé Choiseul, was often copied on these letters as an afterthought, not as the primary recipient. The chain of command, when you reconstruct it from the documents, ran from the Empress of Austria to the Marquise de Pompadour, and from Pompadour to the French king. The official ministers were implementing decisions that had already been made in the space between 2 women, and yet, within weeks of her death, that entire apparatus of influence was dismantled. Her brother was permitted to retain some of her art collection, but her political papers were reviewed and purged. The official narrative, written by the men who had once knelt to her, was that she had been a charming companion, nothing more. The war she had championed was blamed on the king's weakness, not her agency. The ministers she had appointed rewrote their own memoirs to minimize her role. The slow, grinding work of historical erasure had begun, and it was so successful that even today, the popular image of Madame de Pompadour is that of a porcelain shepherdess, not a war leader. The same pattern emerges in the papers of Diane de Poitiers. Her letters to the king were mostly destroyed after Henry II's death, but her household accounts survived, hidden in the archives of the Château d'Annet, her estate of exile. Those accounts, which recorded every payment and every gift, are a map of her political network. They show payments to spies, to informants inside the Spanish court, to the printers who produced propaganda supporting her faction, and to the clerics who advanced her hardline Catholic policies in the pulpits. They show that she was not merely influencing the king through affection. She was running a political operation of impressive sophistication, with funded assets across multiple kingdoms. When Catherine de' Medici exiled her, she was not just punishing a rival in love. She was dismantling an entire parallel government. Alice Keppel's later life illuminates the strange half-life that followed the loss of power. After Edward VII died, she maintained a quiet dignity, retreating to her villa in Florence and her house in London, occasionally appearing in society but never attempting to regain the influence she had lost. But the truly remarkable part of her story is what happened to her daughter, Violet Trefusis. Violet grew up, aware of her mother's position, and she inherited the family talent for navigating unconventional relationships. She became the lover of the writer Vita Sackville-West, in a passionate, scandalous affair that captivated literary London and was chronicled in Virginia Woolf's novel Orlando. The daughter of the King's Back Channel became the muse of modernist literature. The intimate access to power that Alice had used to shape foreign policy was transformed, in the next generation, into intimate access to the creative forces that would define a new century. But the most startling family twist belongs to Alice Keppel's other descendant. Her great-granddaughter is Camilla Parker Bowles, now Queen Camilla of the United Kingdom, the wife of King Charles III. A royal mistress's bloodline, after a century of quiet respectability, has returned to the throne itself, this time with a crown and a title and an official acknowledgement that the woman at the king's side is not a secret to be hidden, but a consort to be celebrated. The wheel of history has turned, and the descendant of the woman who had to hide her political work from the public is now anointed with holy oil at Westminster Abbey. Lola Montez, of course, left no such lineage. She died poor, sick, and largely forgotten. But her story did not end with her body in a New York grave. In the early 20th century, historians of the 1848 revolutions began to revisit her role, and they discovered something that the conservative narratives of the time had suppressed. Lola Montez was not simply a reckless meddler who accidentally sparked a revolution. Her liberal political convictions were genuine, and the reforms she pushed Ludwig to adopt, curtailing the power of the church, opening universities, liberalizing the press, were aligned with the progressive movements that would eventually reshape Europe. She was on the wrong side of history in the short term, but the history that came later vindicated many of her positions. The Jesuit order she hated was eventually suppressed across much of Europe. The liberal reforms she championed became the foundation of modern Bavarian governance. The king who abdicated because of her was Ludwig I, but the Munich he left behind was a city that had been forced, by the crisis she triggered, to confront the limits of absolute monarchy. The common thread is a cruel and exquisite irony. The royal mistress was erased because she was inconvenient to the institutions that wrote history. But the very act of erasing her has made her, in the digital age, a subject of obsessive scholarly reconstruction. The letters that were scattered are being reassembled. The portraits that were taken down are being reattributed. The accounts that were hidden are being analyzed, and the woman who was supposed to be a footnote is becoming the central figure. Because the more the archives reveal, the clearer it becomes that the history of European monarchy cannot be understood without her. Consider the question that opened our journey. How did women with no legal standing, no official office, and no right to be heard end up shaping the fate of nations? The answer, now visible in the digitized letters and reconstructed networks, is that the formal machinery of monarchy was never the whole story. The official council chamber was only one node in a larger system of influence. The bedchamber, the private salon, the morning levee, the evening card game. These were the spaces where trust was built and decisions were seated. And the person who controlled access to those spaces, who managed the king's moods, who translated the dry language of policy into the personal language of loyalty and fear and desire, was an unofficial prime minister who happened to share the king's bed. The monarchy needed this figure because the king was not an abstract institution. He was a human being, subject to loneliness, boredom, insecurity, and the constant manipulation of everyone around him. The formal ministers competed for his ear, but the mistress had already captured it. She could frame an argument in a way that no minister could, because she understood the king not as a sovereign, but as a man. And the ministers, for all their resentment, recognized this. That is why they routed their arguments through her. That is why they paid her the tribute of flattery and deference. That is why, when the king died, they were the first to deny her influence. Because acknowledging it would have been acknowledging their own complicity in a system that violated every principle of constitutional government and divine right. Now, a final detail, the one that changes the color of everything we have examined. It concerns the fate of the letters that were never burned. In the basement of the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, there is a collection of papers known as the Mélanges de Colbert, a miscellany of documents, gathered by the great minister's family. Among them, misfiled and overlooked for 300 years, is a sheaf of letters written by Diane de Poitiers to Henry II in the final months of his reign. They are not love letters, They are strategic memoranda discussing the peace negotiations with Spain, the appointments of bishops, and the management of the Protestant threat. What makes them extraordinary is that they are annotated in the margins by Henry's own hand. He was not merely receiving her advice. He was actively responding to it, debating it, weighing it against the counsel of his official ministers. The king and his mistress were co-rulers, on paper, in ink that has survived the centuries. And right there is the deepest truth. The erasure of the royal mistress was never complete because it could not be. The evidence of her power was woven too tightly into the fabric of state. The treaties she shaped bore her fingerprints. The wars she started left her traces. The men she appointed wrote her into their own stories, however reluctantly. The archives are a minefield for the official narrative. Every time a new collection is digitized, another piece of the true history surfaces, and the portrait of the passive consort and the all-powerful king crumbles a little more. The women we have followed tonight, Pay, Pompadour, Diane, Keppel, Montez, were not exceptions to the rule of monarchy. They were the rule, the hidden constant that made the system function. They were the unofficial rulers who did the work that the official rulers could not acknowledge. And the price they paid was not just the fall from grace, the exile, the poverty, the early death. The price was their place in history itself. They were written out of the story so thoroughly that for centuries we believed the lie that they had never been there at all. But the story is being rewritten now, not by a revolution or a decree, but by the quiet, patient labor of archivists, historians, and digital scanners. The women who were erased are being restored to the record, letter by letter, account, book by account, book. And as they return to view, we are forced to confront a truth that the old historians found unbearable, that the history of Europe was not made solely by kings in council, but also by women in chambers that the official records refuse to acknowledge. The mistress is coming out of the shadows, and the face she shows is not the face of a fallen woman, but the face of a ruler who was never allowed to rule openly, who governed from the only space available to her, and who was punished for succeeding by being made to disappear. And yet, for all that has been recovered, there remains one last room in the archive that has never been opened, one final collection of letters that no historian has been allowed to read. They are the letters of a woman whose name you may not know, but whose influence may have been greater than all the others combined. A woman who served not one king but three, who shaped the foreign policy of an empire across 6 decades, and who was so successfully erased that even her existence is disputed. Her story, still waiting in the sealed boxes of a private collection, is the reason that the history of the royal mistress is not over yet. It is only just beginning to be told. The sealed boxes I mentioned belong to a private archive in Vienna, the collection of the Colelto family, and inside them, according to the fragmentary catalogues that have been glimpsed by scholars, are the papers of Countess Wilhelmine von Colalto, known to her contemporaries as Wilhelmina Schroeder. She served 3 successive Habsburg emperors across a span of 60 years, from the final flowering of the Holy Roman Empire through the Napoleonic Wars and into the Age of Metternich. She was, by all contemporary whispers, the single most powerful woman in the Austrian court. Diplomats called her the Secret Empress. Ministers complained in coded diaries that nothing reached the imperial ear without her approval. And when she died in 1830, her entire correspondence was locked away by her family, who were embarrassed by her position. It has never been opened to historians. The archivists who have petitioned for access have been refused, politely but firmly, for nearly 2 centuries. Somewhere in those boxes, in ink that has not seen light since the age of horse-drawn carriages, is the complete record of an unofficial reign that spanned the Congress of Vienna and the remaking of Europe after Napoleon. And the family that holds them is still deciding whether the world is ready to know what they contain. That is the lingering question at the heart of this story. the question that keeps us all up at night if we let it. How much of history is still sealed away because someone, somewhere decided that the truth was too inconvenient, too shameful, or too dangerous to the reputations of the powerful? The women we met tonight, Pompadour, Diane, Alice, Lola, and the many others whose names flickered briefly in the margins of the official record, were not isolated anomalies. They were part of a vast, interconnected system that stretched from Lisbon to St. Petersburg, from the court of the Sunday King to the cabinets of Victorian Britain. And in every single one of those courts, the same drama played out. A woman found a path to power that no law provided. She exercised that power with a skill that often exceeded the men around her, and when her moment passed, she was erased so thoroughly that even her grandchildren did not know what she had done. The fact that we know their names now is not a sign that the erasure failed. It is a sign that we are living through a quiet revolution in the study of history, a revolution driven by digitization, by the work of feminist scholars who refuse to accept the official narratives, and by the slow, patient reconstruction of the archives that were never supposed to be opened. Every year, another cache of letters is catalogued, another account book is transcribed, another portrait is reattributed. The women are coming back, not as the caricatures their enemies painted, the scheming courtesan, the foreign adventuress, the love-struck fool, but as the political operators they actually were. And what they force us to confront is not just a correction to the historical record. It is a fundamental reassessment of how power works. The formal institutions of government, the councils, the parliaments, the ministries, are only one layer of political reality. Beneath that layer, and often more consequential, are the informal channels, the private conversation, the whispered advice, the trusted intermediary who can say to a ruler what no minister dares. The royal mistress was not an aberration. She was the most visible symptom of a truth that applies to every age and every system, that the people who shape history are often not the people whose names appear in the official documents. They are the gatekeepers, the confidants, the trusted ears, and they operate in spaces that power is designed to deny exist. This truth is not limited to monarchy. Every institution, every corporation, every government has its unofficial power structures, its hidden influencers, its back channels. The only difference is that in our own time, we have not yet had the benefit of centuries of archival excavation. We are living through the same dynamics, the same arrangements, the same quiet exercise of influence by people who are not on the organizational chart, and we do not know, because the people who benefit from those arrangements will never write them down where we can read them. So when you lie in the dark tonight, letting the details of Pompadour's war councils and Diane's signed decrees and Alice's diplomatic tea parties drift through your mind, consider the rooms you have been in, the conversations you have overheard, the decisions that were made not in the boardroom but over a quiet drink afterward. Consider the people who influenced you, and the people you have influenced, in ways that no biography will ever record. History is never the whole story. It is only the story that someone was willing to tell, and the people who tell it have interests of their own. If you enjoyed this journey into the hidden courts of Europe, please take a moment to tap the like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you actually enjoyed drifting off to stories of power. See Creasy and the women who ruled from the shadows. Drop a comment below telling me where you are listening from tonight, what time it is for you, and whether you think the sealed letters in Vienna should finally be opened. Now dim those lights, tuck the blankets a little closer, and let yourself slip into the soft, dark quiet. The archive is waiting. The letters are still sealed, and the women who were erased are still whispering, in ink that has slept for centuries, the true story of everything we thought we knew.